The forward operating base fell silent when the radio crackled with static, then died. Major Catherine Rook Dalton stood in the operations center, her hand frozen over the communications panel as the last known position of Wildcat 2-1 blinked red on the digital display. Captain Marcus Rivera had been flying close air support for a trapped Marine unit when his A-10 Thunderbolt disappeared from radar 17 minutes ago. The mountains of Helmand Province had swallowed aircraft before, their jagged peaks and narrow valleys creating dead zones where even the most advanced systems went dark. But Rivera wasn't just any pilot. He was a single father of twin daughters, 8 years old, who kept their photo taped to his instrument panel. He flew with the kind of precision that came from knowing exactly what he had waiting at home. The Marines on the ground were taking sustained fire from a fortified position in a canyon complex, pinned down with casualties mounting. They'd called for immediate air support 40 minutes ago. Rivera had been their answer. Now he was gone, and the enemy knew it. Catherine watched the seconds tick by on the mission clock. Standard procedure said to declare an aircraft lost after 20 minutes of no contact. Search and rescue protocols would activate. Another pilot would be scrambled. The Marines would have to wait. She'd been in this operations center for 3 years, coordinating strike missions across some of the most hostile airspace in theater. She knew the statistics, knew how rarely pilots survived ejection in these mountains, knew that hope had a half-life measured in minutes. But something felt wrong about this silence. Rivera's last transmission had been calm, professional, reporting his approach vector to the target area. No distress call. No indication of mechanical failure or enemy fire. Just the routine acknowledgement of a pilot who'd made this run dozens of times before. Then nothing. The tactical air controller for the Marine unit, a sergeant named DeMarco, kept trying to raise Rivera on the emergency frequency. His voice had gone from urgent to desperate to something harder, something that accepted the mathematics of loss. Catherine had pulled Rivera's personnel file an hour ago, though she'd memorized most of it years before. 42 years old, 18 years in service, 317 combat missions, widower for 5 years after his wife died from cancer, sole guardian, 0 disciplinary actions, impeccable safety record. The kind of pilot who treated every sortie like his daughters were watching. She understood that last part better than most. Catherine had earned her call sign, Rook, not from chess but from the bird, patient, intelligent, methodical. She'd flown A-10s herself before a training accident shattered her left leg in 7 places, ending her flying career but not her service. The transition from cockpit to operations center had felt like exile at first, watching other pilots take the missions she'd trained for. But she'd learned a different kind of flying, coordinating multiple aircraft, reading the battlefield from above, becoming the voice that guided pilots through chaos. Rivera had been one of her most reliable assets. He flew like he had nothing to prove and everything to protect. The base commander, Colonel Vance, entered the operations center with his usual heavy footsteps. He glanced at the display, then at Catherine. His expression carried the weight of command decisions that would be dissected in after-action reports regardless of outcome. "Time?" he asked, though he could see the clock himself. 19 minutes since last contact, Catherine replied. Her voice remained steady, professional, even as her mind calculated probabilities she didn't want to consider. Vance nodded slowly. "Prepare the notification team." It wasn't a question. Standard protocol for a downed pilot with dependents required immediate family notification procedures. The twins would be in school right now, probably thinking about whatever 8-year-old girls thought about on Tuesday mornings. Softball practice, book reports, whether their dad would be home in time to make pancakes on Saturday like he always did between deployments. Catherine's hand moved toward the phone that would start that machinery of grief. The radio erupted with noise. Not static this time. Not silence, the distinct roar of a GAU-8 Avenger cannon tearing the air apart at 65 rounds per second. Then Rivera's voice, calm as morning coffee, slightly out of breath but unmistakably alive. Wildcat 2-1, guns, 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 target destroyed, Marines you're clear to advance north. The operations center froze. Every head turned toward the speakers. DeMarco's voice came back immediately, younger than it had sounded a moment ago, renewed by something that might have been hope or might have been disbelief. Wildcat 2-1, where the hell have you been? We thought you'd crashed. Rivera's response carried the faintest edge of dry humor, the kind that only emerged when a pilot had just done something either brilliant or insane. Negative, DeMarco. Radio malfunction. Went dark to reposition. Had to get creative with the approach vector. Catherine pulled up the live feed from the drone circling 2,000 feet above the engagement zone. The video showed the canyon where the Marines had been pinned, and the burning remains of what had been a fortified enemy position carved into the cliff face. The A-10 Thunderbolt banked hard left across the screen, its distinctive profile unmistakable. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the massive cannon protruding from the nose, the straight wings designed for low-altitude punishment rather than grace. Rivera's aircraft looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and malice, exactly the way an A-10 should look. The gun run had been surgical. 3 emplacements that had survived conventional strikes were now smoking craters. The Marines were already moving, their formation spreading across the valley floor toward their objective. Colonel Vance exhaled slowly, the sound of a commander recalculating the reports he'd been mentally drafting. Get me his gun camera footage. I want to know what creative means in this context. Catherine was already pulling the data stream, her fingers moving across the console with practiced efficiency. The A-10's targeting pod had recorded everything, and what she saw in those first frames made her lean closer to the screen. Rivera hadn't just repositioned. He'd done something she'd never seen attempted in combat. The footage showed his aircraft descending into the canyon system itself, dropping below the ridgeline where radar coverage died and visual acquisition became a nightmare. He'd flown nap of the earth through a series of connected ravines, using the terrain to mask his approach, navigating by instruments and memory through a space barely wider than his wingspan. The A-10 wasn't built for that kind of flying. It was built to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower, not to thread needles through mountain passes. But Rivera had done exactly that, emerging from an angle the enemy hadn't thought to defend, because no sane pilot would have considered it possible. Catherine watched the altitude readings in the corner of the footage. At points, Rivera had been less than 50 feet above the canyon floor, banking around rock formations, adjusting his angle to avoid jutting outcrops that would have torn his wings off with inches to spare. The A-10's titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit was designed to keep pilots alive through ground fire, not to excuse this kind of risk. But Rivera had turned terrain into weapon, transformed a death trap into an approach vector, and delivered ordnance exactly where it needed to be from an angle that made defensive fire impossible. The Marines confirmed their advance was successful. 2 casualties evacuated, but the unit was intact and moving on their objective ahead of schedule. Colonel Vance studied the footage over Catherine's shoulder, his jaw working slightly as he processed the implications. That's either the best flying I've seen in 30 years or the worst judgment. Haven't decided which. Both, Catherine said quietly. Definitely both. Rivera's voice came through again, this time on the standard frequency, addressing the operations center directly. Rook, this is Wildcat 2-1. Request clearance to return to base. I'm Winchester on 30 Mike. Fuel is comfortable. Aircraft is green. Winchester meant he'd expended all ammunition from the Avenger cannon. 30 Mike referred to the 30mm rounds the GAU-8 fired. Comfortable fuel meant he had enough to make it home without cutting margins too thin. Aircraft green meant no damage, all systems operational. The terminology was economical, precise, deliberately understated given what he'd just accomplished. Catherine keyed her microphone. Wildcat 2-1, Rook copies. Cleared direct return, maintain current altitude, contact tower on approach. Be advised the commander wants to see you immediately upon landing. A pause, just long enough to suggest Rivera understood the subtext. "Copy that, Rook. I'll bring cookies." The levity felt deliberate, a pressure valve on tension that had been building since his radio went silent. Catherine allowed herself a small smile despite the professional mask she maintained. Rivera's cockpit banter was legendary, but only because it existed in perfect proportion to his competence. He never joked when the situation was actively dangerous. Only after, when the immediate threat had passed and the mission was complete. The A-10 appeared on the tower's visual approach 10 minutes later, descending through broken clouds with landing gear already down. The Thunderbolt looked even more ungainly from the ground than in flight, its utilitarian design prioritizing function over aesthetics in every line. The landing was textbook smooth, the kind that suggested hours in the simulator and the muscle memory that came from repetition. Rivera taxied to his designated hardstand where the ground crew was already waiting with chocks and tie-downs. Catherine left the operations center, something she rarely did during active flight operations, but she wanted to see Rivera's face when he climbed out. Colonel Vance was already walking across the tarmac, his stride purposeful but not rushed. The canopy opened and Rivera emerged, his helmet off, hair plastered with sweat, flight suit dark under the arms and across the back. He was shorter than his aircraft made him seem, compact and athletic despite being in his 40s. His face showed the weathering that came from years in the cockpit, lines around his eyes from squinting against sun and focusing on instruments. He spotted Catherine and Vance approaching and stood a little straighter. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Hollies who'd been maintaining A-10s longer than some of the pilots had been alive, was already circling the aircraft with his checklist. Rivera climbed down using the built-in ladder, his movements economical. When his boots hit the tarmac, he turned to face the officers, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. Colonel Vance stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak without shouting over the ambient noise of the flight line, far enough to maintain the formal distance of rank. "Captain Rivera, explain." Rivera didn't hesitate. "Sir, enemy position was hardened against conventional approach vectors. Overhead runs were being tracked and engaged. Marines were taking casualties. I assessed that a terrain-masked approach through the ravine system would provide surprise and optimal firing angle. Radio failed during descent. Suspected antenna damage from proximity to rock faces. Maintained radio silence to avoid compromising position. Destroyed 3 emplacements with cannon fire. Confirmed friendly forces were clear, egressed clean." The explanation was delivered in the same tone Rivera might have used to describe a training exercise. Calm, factual, stripped of anything that might sound like he was asking for credit or making excuses. Catherine noticed his hands were steady. No post-adrenaline tremor, no visible signs of stress. He'd either mastered the art of appearing unshaken or genuinely was. Vance's expression remained unreadable. "You flew an A-10 through a canyon system in combat without radio contact, below effective radar coverage, with vertical clearance measured in feet. That's not creative, that's reckless." "Yes, sir," Rivera acknowledged without defensiveness. "It was calculated risk. The alternative was watching Marines die while waiting for conventional assets to cycle through. I had the terrain memorized from previous reconnaissance. I had fuel, I had ammunition, and I had the aircraft to do it. The A-10 is built for close air support in contested environments. I provided close air support in a contested environment. The logic was airtight even if the flying had been borderline suicidal." Catherine found herself appreciating the way Rivera framed it, not as heroics but as resource allocation. He'd had tools available and a problem to solve. The fact that the solution involved flying through a space most pilots wouldn't attempt in daylight with perfect weather was presented as incidental. "You have daughters," Vance said quietly, and the shift in his tone suggested this was the real question. Not about tactical judgment or flight procedures, but about the calculation Rivera had made regarding acceptable risk when he had people depending on him. Rivera's expression softened fractionally. "Yes, sir. Emma and Sophie. They're why I made sure to come back. They're also why I couldn't sit at altitude while Marines who also have families were dying on the ground. It was the right answer and the true answer which didn't always align. Catherine could see Vance processing it, weighing the competing obligations of command. Rivera had violated several safety protocols. He'd also saved lives and accomplished the mission objective. The after-action review would be complicated. "Get cleaned up," Vance said finally. "Report to my office in 1 hour. Bring your flight recorder data. We're going to walk through every second of that run." Rivera saluted. "Yes, sir." He held the salute until Vance returned it, then relaxed. As Vance walked away, Catherine stepped closer. "That was either brilliant or insane." "The Major already said both," Rivera replied with a slight smile. "I'm consistent if nothing else." "Your radio actually fail?" Catherine asked. It was a fair question. Radio malfunctions happen, but the timing was suspiciously convenient. Rivera's smile didn't waver. "Intermittent contact at best once I dropped into the ravines. The canyon walls play hell with line-of-sight transmission. I could have climbed to re-establish, but that would have compromised the approach. So yes, it failed, because I put myself in a position where it would fail as a necessary consequence of the tactics I chose." "That's a very precise way of saying you knew you'd lose comms and did it anyway," Catherine observed. "Precision is important in close air support," Rivera said. "The Marines appreciate it." He wasn't wrong. Catherine had already seen the citation that would be written, probably over Rivera's objections. The tactical innovation alone was worth studying. The execution under pressure was noteworthy. The outcome was undeniable. "Your daughters know you do this?" she asked. It was more personal than she usually allowed herself with pilots, but Rivera had a way of making professional distance feel unnecessary. "They know I fly. They know I help people. They don't need to know the specifics until they're older. Right now they think I'm just a pilot who flies a really ugly plane." His affection for the A-10's aesthetic shortcomings was evident in his voice. "The Warthog is beautiful in its own way," Catherine said. It was what every A-10 pilot believed. That function created its own form of grace. "It's a flying gun with delusions of being an aircraft," Rivera corrected. "But it's my flying gun, and it brought me home today. Can't ask for more than that." He excused himself to debrief with his crew chief, leaving Catherine standing on the tarmac watching him walk away. There was something in the casual confidence, the complete lack of need to justify or explain beyond what duty required, that reminded her why she'd loved flying. The after-action review that afternoon was attended by half the wing leadership. Captain Rivera sat at the conference table with his flight data displayed across 3 monitors, walking through the mission minute by minute. Catherine watched from the back of the room, officially present as the operations officer who'd coordinated the mission, unofficially there because she wanted to see how Rivera handled the scrutiny. The gun camera footage played in real time. The descent into the ravine system looked even more impossible from the cockpit perspective. The A-10's heads-up display showed altitude dropping rapidly, airspeed carefully controlled, wings level despite the confined space. Rivera's hands on the stick and throttle were visible in the reflection of the canopy, steady, making constant minor adjustments. The canyon walls passed close enough that texture was visible in the rock. "Here," Rivera said, pausing the footage. "This is where the radio degraded to unusable. You can see the antenna warning light illuminate on the caution panel. I attempted to climb for better signal, but visual acquisition from that angle would have alerted the enemy position. I made the decision to continue without comms." Colonel Vance leaned forward. "At what point did you consider aborting?" "Continuously," Rivera answered. "Every pilot monitors abort criteria throughout the approach. I was assessing aircraft performance, fuel state, weapon status, terrain clearance, and target geometry. All factors remained within acceptable parameters. If any had degraded below minimums, I would have climbed out immediately." "Define acceptable parameters for terrain clearance," the wing safety officer, a major named Patterson, interjected. His tone carried skepticism. Rivera didn't flinch. "Sufficient clearance to maintain controlled flight without contact." The A-10's wingspan is 57 feet 6 inches. The narrowest point I transited measured approximately 80 feet across. That's comfortable margin for straight flight. Banking required more precision, but the aircraft responded predictably throughout. Comfortable margin. Catherine suppressed a smile at the understatement. Most pilots considered 50 feet of clearance on each wingtip to be threading a needle. Rivera was treating it like a standard procedure. The footage resumed. The canyon opened suddenly into the wider valley where the Marines were pinned. Rivera's targeting pod slewed to acquire the enemy positions carved into the cliff face, 3 fortified points that had been shrugging off indirect fire. The rolled wings level, nose tracking toward the first target. The firing solution was calculated in seconds. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was the most devastating close air support weapon ever mounted on an aircraft. It fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate that turned matter into destructive force on a scale that defied easy description. When Rivera squeezed the trigger, the camera angle shook from the recoil despite the aircraft's mass. The first emplacement disintegrated. Stone, metal, and fortification turned to dust and fragments. The rounds impacted with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel despite being delivered by what amounted to an airborne artillery piece. Rivera adjusted his angle fractionally, firing again. The second position vanished. He banked hard left, giving his aircraft space to line up on the third target while avoiding the debris cloud from the first two. The Avenger spun up once more. The third emplacement suffered the same fate as its companions. Total engagement time, 11 seconds. The Marines' radio traffic came through on the recording, voices urgent with relief and renewed energy. They were moving before the dust settled, advancing through the gap Rivera had created in the enemy's defensive line. The A-10 climbed away, its mission complete, looking for all the world like it had just performed a routine training run rather than an engagement that would be analyzed and discussed for years. The conference room was silent when the footage ended. Major Patterson spoke first. That was extraordinary airmanship and appalling risk calculation in equal measure. Agreed, Colonel Vance said, which is why we're going to document it thoroughly, add it to the training syllabus as a case study in tactical innovation and risk management, and make it very clear that this is not standard procedure. He looked at Rivera. You saved lives today. You also aged me several years when we thought you'd crashed. I'm going to put you in for a commendation and assign you additional safety training. Consider yourself both praised and punished. Rivera nodded. Fair enough, sir. The meeting broke up gradually, officers clustering in small groups to discuss the implications. Catherine waited until Rivera was alone, gathering his materials. You knew that was going to be the outcome, she said. Commendation and remediation. Rivera smiled slightly. I know Colonel Vance, he's fair. He rewards results and addresses risks. I gave him both, so he's addressing both. It's leadership done right. How do you do it? Catherine asked. The question was broader than she intended, encompassing more than just the day's mission. Rivera seemed to understand. Do what? The flying. All of it. The risk, the responsibility, the daughters waiting at home, the knowledge that every mission could be the last one. How do you climb into that cockpit knowing what could happen? Rivera was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The way I see it, fear is just information. It tells you what matters. My daughters matter. The Marines on the ground matter. The mission matters. Fear tries to make those things mutually exclusive, like I have to choose between keeping myself safe and keeping others safe. But that's a false choice. The safest thing I can do for my daughters is be the kind of father they can be proud of. That means doing the work that needs doing, using the skills I have, accepting the risks that come with the job, not reckless risks, calculated ones. Today felt reckless, Catherine said quietly. Today was calculated, Rivera corrected gently. I had memorized that terrain. I'd studied the canyon system during previous reconnaissance runs. I knew the A-10's performance envelope. I understood the tactical situation. Everything I did was based on training, preparation, and judgment. It looked reckless because the margins were tight, but tight margins executed properly are still safe. Reckless is when you exceed your capabilities or your aircraft's capabilities. I did neither. Catherine wanted to argue, but she'd seen the data. Rivera's airspeed had never varied more than 5 knots from optimal. His altitude had been precisely controlled. His weapons employment had been textbook. The only thing unconventional was the approach vector, and even that had been methodically planned. "You could teach this," she said suddenly. "Not the specifics, but the thought process. How to assess unconventional options without crossing into genuine recklessness." "Maybe," Rivera allowed, "but that's a hard thing to teach. It requires trusting your training enough to innovate, but respecting your limitations enough to recognize when innovation becomes improvisation without foundation." The next morning, Catherine found Rivera in the squadron-ready room, updating the mission board with the previous day's sortie statistics. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who treated administrative tasks with the same professionalism as flying. "Your daughters know you're safe?" she asked. Rivera nodded. "Called them last night. Told them I had a good day at work, helped some people, the plane behaved itself. They told me about their science project on ecosystems. Sophie is convinced I should make a terrarium in my quarters. Emma thinks that's ridiculous because I'm barely here enough to water it." The casual domesticity of it contrasted sharply with the violence of the previous day's work. Catherine marveled at the compartmentalization required to move between those worlds, from firing depleted uranium rounds through fortified positions to discussing terrariums with 8-year-old daughters. "Do they understand what you really do?" she asked. Rivera considered the question seriously. "They understand I'm a pilot in a war zone. They understand that means danger. They don't understand the specifics, and I don't burden them with those. When they're older, if they ask, I'll tell them the truth. But right now they need stability and normalcy more than they need complete transparency. My job is to be their dad first, and that means protecting them from worrying about things they can't control." It was a philosophy Catherine respected even as she wondered about its sustainability. How long could Rivera maintain that separation? How long could any pilot balance the competing demands of combat operations and single parenthood? "They're lucky to have you," she said. Rivera smiled. "I'm lucky to have them. They give me a reason to come home that's more compelling than anything else possibly could be. Makes me a better pilot, actually. I don't take stupid risks because I know exactly what I'd be leaving behind." The irony wasn't lost on Catherine. Rivera claimed his daughters made him more cautious, even as he just completed one of the most audacious flying displays she'd witnessed. But perhaps that was the point. What looked like extreme risk to an outside observer was, in Rivera's calculation, the safest path to the outcome he needed. The following weeks established a new rhythm. Rivera flew his assigned missions with the same competence that had always characterized his work, but Catherine noticed the other pilots watching him differently now. The story of the Canyon Run had spread through the squadron, acquiring embellishments with each retelling. Rivera neither encouraged nor discouraged the mythology building around the incident. He simply continued doing his job. Catherine found herself assigning Rivera to increasingly complex missions, not as a test, but because she trusted his judgment in situations that required more than standard procedures. He validated that trust repeatedly, bringing creativity to tactical problems without veering into genuine recklessness. The Marines from the unit Rivera had supported requested him specifically for subsequent operations. That kind of ground force confidence in a pilot was rare and earned through consistent performance. One afternoon, Catherine received a message through official channels. Rivera's daughters were being featured in their school's art show, and he'd been granted a brief leave to attend via video conference. The message asked if Catherine could ensure the connection was stable during the scheduled time. It was a small thing, but it revealed the infrastructure required to maintain normal life from a combat zone. She made sure the communications center prioritized the connection. On the scheduled day, she happened to walk past the small office Rivera had borrowed for the video call. Through the partially open door, she could see him on screen with two identical girls, their faces bright with excitement as they held up drawings. His expression was transformed, softer than she'd ever seen it, completely focused on them with an attention that matched the intensity he brought to mission planning. "That's amazing, Sophie," she heard him say. "Tell me about the colors you chose." The casual pride in his voice carried a warmth that combat operations never revealed. Catherine moved on without interrupting, but the image stayed with her. Rivera wasn't just a pilot with dependents. He was a father who happened to be a pilot, and those priorities shaped everything about how he approached the work. The next major engagement came 3 weeks after the canyon run. A special operations team had been inserted deep in hostile territory for a high-value target mission. The extraction had gone wrong, enemy reinforcements had arrived faster than expected, and the team was fighting their way to an emergency pickup zone under sustained fire. Rivera was assigned as primary close air support, with Catherine coordinating from the operations center. The engagement was textbook initially. Rivera provided danger-close fire support, his cannon runs precisely eliminating threats within meters of friendly positions. But the situation deteriorated when the extraction helicopters took damage on approach and had to abort. The special operations team was stranded, low on ammunition, with enemy forces converging from multiple directions. Rivera's voice on the radio remained calm. "Rook, Wildcat 2-1. Ground commander is requesting sustained air coverage until alternate extraction can be arranged. Current ammunition state is 20%. Fuel is sufficient for 30 minutes on station." Catherine checked the board. The nearest supporting aircraft was 15 minutes out. Other assets were engaged or repositioning. Rivera was alone with a team that would be overrun without air support. "Wildcat 2-1, Rook copies. Be advised additional assets are en route. Maintain coverage as long as ammunition permits." "Understood," Rivera replied. "Going Winchester means going home, and these guys don't have that option. I'll make it work." For the next 18 minutes, Catherine watched Rivera's aircraft orbit the contact area, making repeated gun runs with decreasing ammunition. Each burst of the Avenger was shorter than the last, carefully rationed, precisely placed. He was fighting an arithmetic problem, finite rounds against infinite enemies, buying time measured in minutes for people whose survival depended on his judgment. The ground commander's radio traffic painted the picture. Each of Rivera's runs eliminated an advancing element, disrupted an assault, forced enemies into cover. He wasn't winning the fight. He was preventing the loss, holding the line through pure persistence and precision. "Wildcat 2-1 ammunition state?" Catherine asked, though she could track it herself from his weapons employment. She wanted to hear his voice, needed to confirm he was still thinking clearly under the pressure of extended combat. 5%, Rivera replied. "Enough for one more meaningful run, maybe two if I'm very selective. Relief package." 4 minutes out, Catherine told him. The F-16s from a neighboring base were inbound, loaded for ground attack, faster and more modern than the A-10, but lacking its loiter time and weapons precision. "Understood. Making final run now. Will remain on station for visual coordination until relief arrives." Rivera's aircraft rolled into its last attack, the Avenger firing in controlled bursts that suggested he was counting individual rounds. The gun camera showed targets falling, enemies breaking contact, a temporary respite in the pressure on the special operations team. Then the gun stopped. Winchester for real this time. The A-10 climbed to a safer altitude but didn't leave. Rivera circled the engagement area, talking the incoming F-16s onto their targets, coordinating fire from his weaponless aircraft through sheer presence and knowledge of the tactical situation. The special operations team was extracted 20 minutes later, every member accounted for, wounded but alive. Rivera escorted the helicopters until they were clear of the threat area, then returned to base. He landed with empty ammunition drums and minimal fuel, having stretched every resource to its absolute limit without crossing into recklessness. Catherine met him on the flight line again. Rivera climbed out of the cockpit looking more tired than she'd seen him, the kind of exhaustion that came from sustained decision-making under pressure rather than physical exertion. "That was a long day," she said. Rivera nodded. "Those operators have families too. Someone's husband, someone's father, someone's son. They needed someone to stay, so I stayed. The A-10 is built for that, for persistence, for refusing to leave until the job is finished." "You were running on fumes," Catherine observed. "Literally and figuratively." But I made it back, Rivera pointed out. That's the only standard that matters. Mission complete, aircraft recovered, everyone goes home. Good day. He walked toward the debriefing room without waiting for a response, leaving Catherine to wonder how many more times Rivera could push margins that thin before mathematics caught up with skill. The Special Operations Commander, a lieutenant colonel named Hayes, flew to the base 2 days later specifically to thank Rivera in person. The meeting occurred in Colonel Vance's office, with Catherine present as the operations officer who'd coordinated the support. Hayes was compact and intense, the kind of officer whose presence suggested coiled energy and absolute competence. He shook Rivera's hand with the grip of someone who understood exactly what had happened in that engagement. Captain Rivera, my team wanted me to tell you personally that we're alive because you refused to leave. That kind of commitment to close air support is what makes our mission possible. Rivera accepted the thanks with his characteristic understated professionalism. Your team did the hard part on the ground, sir. I just provided supporting fires. It's what A-10s are built for. Supporting fires for 30 minutes after you ran dry, Hayes corrected. Coordinating follow-on assets, talking helicopters through the hot landing zone, maintaining visual coverage. You didn't have weapons, but you had presence, and that made the difference. My operators know what it means when an A-10 stays on station. It means someone's watching, someone's committed. That's psychological warfare against the enemy and life support for friendlies. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, discussing tactics and coordination procedures, the kind of professional dialogue that occurred between people who understood their work at the highest levels. Catherine contributed technical details about the coordination timeline, but mostly she observed the mutual respect between Hayes and Rivera, two professionals who operated in different domains but shared the same commitment to mission accomplishment and taking care of people. After Hayes departed, Colonel Vance sat back in his chair, studying Rivera with an expression that suggested calculation. You're building quite a reputation, Captain. The Marines love you. The Special Operations community loves you. My safety officers are terrified of you. It's an interesting combination. Rivera smiled faintly. I just fly the missions assigned, sir. I don't seek out complicated situations. They find me, and I handle them with the tools available. About that, Vance said, I'm recommending you for upgrade training to flight lead. You've demonstrated tactical judgment and mission command capabilities beyond what we typically see at the captain level. You'd be responsible for leading formations, mentoring junior pilots, and representing the squadron in complex operations. It was both recognition and responsibility, the kind of advancement that came with additional authority and additional pressure. Catherine knew Rivera would accept. He wasn't the type to decline opportunities to contribute more, but she wondered what it would cost him. I'm honored, sir, Rivera said. When would training commence? After this deployment, Vance replied. You've earned a rotation home. Spend time with your daughters, decompress, then we'll talk about next steps. The meeting concluded with handshakes and the administrative details of career progression. As they left the office, Catherine walked alongside Rivera. Flight lead is a big step. Ready for it. Ready as I'll be, Rivera said. It's the natural progression. Lead from the front, set the example, take care of the newer pilots. The same things I do now, just with more formal authority. And more responsibility, Catherine added. Every pilot you lead becomes your concern, not just your own aircraft. Rivera nodded seriously. I understand. It's the weight of command, the obligation that comes with rank and experience. But it's also an opportunity to share what I've learned, to help younger pilots develop their judgment. The A-10 community is small. We take care of our own. They walked in silence for a moment before Catherine asked the question that had been on her mind. Do you ever think about what you'll tell your daughters, when they're old enough to understand what you really do out here? Rivera was quiet, his gaze distant. I think about it constantly. I'll tell them the truth, that their dad was privileged to serve with extraordinary people, that the work mattered, that the danger was real but managed through training and discipline. I'll tell them about the Marines and the operators and the missions where everything went right. I'll probably tell them about the Canyon Run too, because they'll hear about it eventually. and I'll make sure they understand that all of it was driven by the same principle. Take care of people, use the tools you have, do the work that needs doing. The rotation home happened 6 weeks later. Rivera departed on a transport flight with the casual efficiency of someone who'd made the journey many times. Catherine was in the operations center when he stopped by to say goodbye. "Keep the new guys safe," Rivera said. "Don't let them develop bad habits. The A-10 is forgiving, but combat isn't." "Fly safe," Catherine replied. "Your daughters are waiting." Rivera's smile was genuine. "That's the plan." 3 weeks of terrible pancakes and school events, and absolutely zero tactical decisions more complicated than whether to go to the park or the library. "I can't wait." He left, and the operations center felt smaller without his presence. Catherine had coordinated dozens of pilots over her years in the role, but Rivera's particular combination of competence and humanity stood out. He made the work feel meaningful rather than mechanical. The squadron continued operations without him, other pilots flying the missions, maintaining the tempo of combat operations. But Catherine noticed the difference. The new pilots were talented but untested. The experienced ones were competent but lacked Rivera's instinct for creative solutions. The missions got accomplished, but they felt more routine, less inspired. 2 weeks into Rivera's leave, Catherine received a message through unofficial channels. One of the Marines from the unit Rivera had supported in the Canyon Run had written a letter, and somehow it had made its way to the operations center. Catherine opened it during a rare quiet moment. The letter was handwritten, the kind of communication that took effort in an age of digital immediacy. The Marine, a corporal named DeMarco, the same tactical air controller who'd been on the ground that day, wrote with the blunt honesty of someone who dealt with life and death regularly. He described the feeling of being pinned down, the mathematical certainty that they were running out of time, the moment when hope seemed like a foolish luxury. Then Rivera's voice on the radio, calm and professional, followed by the distinctive sound of the Avenger cannon. DeMarco wrote about the immediate relief, the way the Marines had moved forward with renewed confidence, knowing someone was watching over them. He wrote about learning later how Rivera had approached, about the flying that must have occurred to make that angle possible. The letter concluded with a simple statement: "Please tell Captain Rivera that my daughter was born 3 weeks ago. I got to meet her because he did his job that day. I named her River, as close to Rivera as I could get without being too obvious. I want her to know someday that she exists because someone she'll never meet refused to give up on us." Catherine read the letter twice, then filed it carefully. She'd make sure Rivera received it when he returned. The gesture deserved acknowledgement. Rivera's leave ended on schedule. He returned to the base looking rested but ready, the kind of refreshed energy that came from time spent on what mattered. Catherine briefed him on the operational tempo during his absence, the missions flown, the tactical developments. Rivera absorbed the information with focused attention, already transitioning back into deployment mindset. "How are Emma and Sophie?" Catherine asked when the official briefing concluded. "Growing too fast," Rivera replied with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "Emma's reading 2 grades above her level. Sophie's decided she wants to be an engineer because she likes building things. They're brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Leaving was harder this time." "It gets harder every time," Catherine said quietly. She'd known enough military parents to recognize the pattern, the increasing difficulty of separation as children grew old enough to understand absence. Rivera nodded. "But the work matters, and they understand that even if they don't like it. We talked about responsibility, about service, about why I do what I do. I think they get it as much as 8-year-olds can." Catherine handed him the letter from DeMarco. "This arrived while you were gone. I think you should read it." Rivera opened the letter, his expression shifting as he read. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. His eyes were bright, emotion carefully controlled but present. "A daughter named River," he said softly. "That's something." "That's everything," Catherine corrected. "That's the why behind all of this. That's the mission objective in human terms." Rivera nodded slowly. "It is. Thank you for sharing this." He returned to flight status immediately. slipping back into the rotation as if he'd never left. But Catherine noticed subtle changes. Rivera flew with the same competence, but with an additional layer of deliberation. He took fractionally longer planning missions, asked more questions about ground force disposition, seemed more attuned to the human element behind the tactical abstractions. The upgrade to flight lead came through during his second week back. Rivera accepted the additional responsibility with characteristic professionalism, immediately beginning to mentor the newer pilots who'd arrived during his absence. Catherine watched him conduct briefings, noting how he emphasized judgment over procedure, how he taught decision-making frameworks rather than rote responses. One briefing in particular stood out. Rivera was discussing close air support tactics with 3 newly arrived pilots, using his canyon run as a case study. But instead of focusing on the technical flying, he emphasized the decision tree that led to that choice. "You always have options," Rivera told them. "The question isn't whether to take risk, it's which risk to take." The conventional approach had risk, time delay while friendlies were exposed. The terrain-masked approach had risk, confined flying and communication loss. I chose the risk I could control through skill rather than the risk that depended on luck. That's the calculation you need to make every mission. One of the new pilots, a lieutenant named Morrison, raised his hand. "But how do you know you can control the risk? How do you distinguish confidence from overconfidence?" It was a good question, the kind that demonstrated thoughtful engagement. Rivera considered his answer carefully. "You know your capabilities through training and honest self-assessment. You know your aircraft's capabilities through study and experience. When you match the tactical requirement against those capabilities, the answer becomes clear. If you're guessing, you're overconfident. If you're calculating, you're confident. The difference is whether you can articulate the specific factors that make success probable." The briefing continued for another hour, Rivera breaking down tactical scenarios, inviting questions, creating an environment where the new pilots felt comfortable admitting uncertainty. Catherine watched from the back of the room, appreciating Rivera's teaching style. He never made the new pilots feel inadequate for asking questions. He treated their development as seriously as he treated mission planning. The weeks accumulated into months. Rivera led formations, coordinated complex missions, continued building his reputation as the pilot you wanted overhead when situations deteriorated. But he also became the pilot who developed others, who created institutional knowledge, who made the squadron stronger through teaching rather than just personal performance. Then came the mission that would test everything Rivera had built. A pilot from another squadron, a captain named Williams, encountered catastrophic mechanical failure during a close air support run. His A-10 suffered engine fire and hydraulic loss simultaneously, the kind of compounding emergency that occurred rarely but devastatingly. Williams managed to eject, but his parachute landed in hostile territory 3 miles behind enemy lines. Search and rescue protocols activated immediately, but the nearest assets were 30 minutes away. Williams was alive on the ground, evading enemy forces, but his position was being triangulated. He had 30 minutes maximum before capture. Rivera was 20 miles away, returning from a different mission, Winchester on ammunition but with fuel remaining. Catherine's voice came through on the radio. "Wildcat 2-1 Rook, be advised we have a pilot down in hostile territory. Search and rescue is en route but delayed. Can you provide visual coverage of the survivor's position?" Rivera's response was immediate. "Rook, Wildcat 2-1, send coordinates. I'm Winchester, but I can be overhead in 5 minutes." Catherine transmitted the data. Rivera altered course, pushing his aircraft toward the location where Williams was fighting to stay alive and free. The situation was impossible by conventional standards. Rivera had no weapons. Search and rescue was too far away. Enemy forces were converging, but Rivera had presence, had experience, and had an aircraft that was built to intimidate even when it couldn't shoot. He arrived over Williams's position and began orbiting at low altitude, making his presence obvious. The A-10's distinctive profile and sound were instantly recognizable, to friendlies as hope, to enemies as threat. The psychological impact of an orbiting warthog was documented. Enemy forces knew what the aircraft could do, even if this particular one currently couldn't. Rivera established radio contact with Williams directly. The pilot's voice was tight with controlled fear but coherent. Wildcat 2-1, this is Wildcat 3-4. I'm down, evading enemy forces closing from multiple directions. I don't have much time. 3-4-2-1, I'm overhead. You're not alone. Search and rescue is en route. Your job is to stay hidden. My job is to make the enemy think twice about looking too hard. Rivera descended to dangerous altitude, his aircraft screaming over the trees where Williams was hiding. The roar of the TF-34 engines was unmistakable, deliberately announced, calculated to draw attention and create uncertainty in enemy forces. Was the A-10 armed? Would it engage? The enemy didn't know, and that uncertainty was a weapon in itself. For 23 minutes, Rivera circled Williams's position, maintaining continuous radio contact, providing navigation guidance, coordinating with incoming search and rescue. He flew low enough to draw ground fire on 3 separate occasions, deliberately making himself the target, pulling enemy attention away from the pilot hidden in the terrain below. Catherine monitored from the operations center, watching Rivera's aircraft orbit on the display, too low, too exposed, with no weapons to defend himself but refusing to leave. It was a different kind of courage than the canyon run, not technical skill but pure commitment, staying present when wisdom suggested departure. The rescue helicopter arrived with Apache escort. Rivera talked them onto Williams's exact position, coordinated the pickup, maintained his orbit until Williams was physically aboard the helicopter and lifting away from danger. Only then did Rivera climb to safe altitude and turn for home. He landed with minimal fuel and maximum exhaustion, the kind that came from extended high-stress operations without the release of weapons employment. Catherine met him on the flight line, and this time Colonel Vance was there too. Rivera climbed down from the cockpit, and before either officer could speak, he said, "Captain Williams is safe. That's all that matters." Vance nodded slowly. "You drew fire 3 times from an unarmed aircraft. You could have been shot down protecting someone who'd already been saved by his ejection seat." "He wasn't saved until he was recovered," Rivera corrected. "Ejection seats get you out of a broken aircraft. They don't get you home. That requires someone staying, someone refusing to accept that distance and risk mean abandoning people. I had fuel. I had time. I had an aircraft whose presence means something. I used what I had." It was vintage Rivera, reducing extraordinary action to logical resource allocation, treating heroism as arithmetic. But Catherine understood what he'd actually done. He'd placed himself at risk with no ability to defend himself, wagering everything on presence and reputation, buying time with nothing but commitment. "They're putting you in for a medal," Vance said. "Probably more than one. The search and rescue commander said you saved Williams's life. The Apache pilot said you were the gutsiest pilot they'd seen. This is going in your record as exemplary performance under extreme circumstances." Rivera shrugged slightly. "I was just flying, sir, doing what A-10 pilots do, staying with the mission until it's finished." Vance smiled. "You say that like it's ordinary. It's not. It's exceptional. And you need to recognize that distinction because we're going to use you as an example for every pilot in this wing. The technical skill matters, but the commitment matters more. That's what you demonstrated today." The recognition came through official channels over the following weeks. Rivera was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions supporting the Marines during the Canyon Run, and an Air Medal for his role in protecting Williams during the downed pilot recovery. The citations were formal, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion, but heavy with official acknowledgement. Rivera accepted both medals in a brief ceremony, his daughters present via video link. Catherine watched as Emma and Sophie saw their father receive recognition for actions they only partially understood. Their pride was visible even through the screen, their young faces bright with the knowledge that their dad had done something important. Afterward, Rivera placed both medals in their original cases and packed them away. "Not displaying them?" Catherine asked. Rivera shook his head. They're symbols, not achievements. The achievement was the mission. The Marines going home, Williams getting recovered. That's what matters. The medal is just paperwork made tangible. Your daughters might want to see them, Catherine suggested. Rivera smiled. I'll show them someday when they're older, when they can understand the context. Right now they just need to know their dad is good at his job and coming home when the deployment ends. The medals complicate that narrative without adding value. It was a perspective Catherine found simultaneously admirable and concerning. Rivera deflected recognition the same way he deflected risk, by treating it as incidental to the actual work. But at some point, the recognition mattered. At some point, Rivera needed to acknowledge that what he did went beyond ordinary. The deployment wound down gradually, the intensity of operations decreasing as strategic objectives shifted. Rivera flew his final combat mission on a clear morning, providing air support for a routine patrol that encountered no resistance. It was anticlimactic after everything that had come before, and Catherine suspected Rivera preferred it that way, going out on a quiet note rather than a dramatic finale. The flight back to the States was scheduled for the following week. Rivera spent his final days at the base conducting handover briefings with the pilots who'd be taking his place in the rotation, ensuring continuity of operations and passing along tactical lessons learned. Catherine found him in the operations center late one evening, updating mission databases and organizing files with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to everything. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Someone else can handle the administrative turnover." Rivera looked up. "I do have to do this. The next operations officer needs clean data and clear procedures. It's part of the mission, making sure the work continues smoothly after I leave. Anything less would be failing the people who come after." "You take responsibility seriously," Catherine observed. "Sometimes too seriously. You don't have to carry everything." "I carry what I can," Rivera replied, "and right now I can carry this. When I can't, I'll ask for help. That's part of knowing your limitations, recognizing when the load exceeds capacity." They worked in silence for a while, organizing materials, ensuring nothing was left incomplete. Finally, Catherine asked the question she'd been considering for months. "What's next for you? After this deployment, after the flight lead training, where does this all go?" Rivera leaned back in his chair, considering. "I keep flying as long as they'll let me. I raise my daughters to be strong, intelligent, independent people. I pass along what I've learned to the next generation of pilots. I stay connected to the mission because it matters. Beyond that," he shrugged, "I take it as it comes. Planning too far ahead assumes I control variables that I don't. I focus on what's in front of me, the next mission, the next year, the next challenge. That's manageable. Anything more becomes speculation." It was a practical philosophy, grounded in the present, acknowledging uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. Catherine respected the clarity even as she wondered if it was sustainable long-term. The departure day arrived with the anticlimax that always characterized the end of deployments. The flight manifest was posted, bags were loaded, final goodbyes were exchanged. Rivera shook hands with the pilots he'd mentored, accepted thanks from the ground crews, made his way to the transport aircraft. Catherine walked with him across the tarmac, neither speaking until they reached the aircraft stairs. "It's been an honor coordinating your mission," she said formally, then less formally, "and watching you work. You made me remember why I wanted to fly in the first place." Rivera smiled. "You still fly, Rook, just from a different seat. What you do matters as much as what any pilot does. Maybe more because you see the whole picture while we're focused on our small piece. Don't discount that." "Take care of those daughters," Catherine said. "Teach them everything you know." "That's the plan," Rivera replied. "Give them the tools to face whatever comes, the judgment to make good decisions, the confidence to trust themselves. Same things I try to give the pilots I train." It's all connected. Whether you're teaching someone to fly or teaching someone to live, the principles are the same. Competence, judgment, responsibility, care. He climbed the stairs and disappeared into the aircraft. Catherine watched it taxi and depart, carrying Rivera and dozens of other personnel back to the lives they'd left behind. The operations center felt emptier when she returned, but the work continued. The rhythm of deployment operations didn't pause for individuals, no matter how exceptional. 6 months passed. Catherine remained in position, coordinating missions, training new operations officers, maintaining the standards Rivera had helped establish. She heard updates through the informal network that connected A-10 pilots. Rivera had completed flight lead training, was now leading formations at his home station, was being considered for squadron command track. Then she received a formal message through official channels. Captain Marcus Rivera had been selected for early promotion to major. The notification included a personal note requesting that Catherine consider accepting assignment to his future squadron as operations officer when her current tour concluded. It was recognition of partnership, acknowledgement that the operations officer and pilot relationship mattered as much as any single individual's contribution. Catherine reviewed the offer carefully. It would mean leaving her current position, relocating, stepping into a role with more responsibility and higher visibility. It would also mean continuing to work with Rivera, continuing to be part of something that felt meaningful rather than merely professional. She accepted. The assignment orders came through 2 months later. Catherine rotated home, processed through the usual administrative requirements, and reported to her new squadron. Rivera was there, his major's oak leaves new on his flight suit, his office larger but not ostentatiously so. "Rook," he greeted her with genuine warmth. "Welcome to the unit. Ready to make some junior pilots' lives complicated through excessively high standards?" "Always," Catherine replied. "Ready to keep pushing margins that make safety officers nervous." "Within reason," Rivera said with a smile. "I've matured, slightly. I now wait until the third meeting before proposing tactics that sound insane but are actually just aggressive." They settled into partnership easily, the kind of professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. Rivera led flights, and Catherine coordinated operations. Together, they created an environment where pilots were challenged to think creatively within the bounds of sound judgment, where innovation was encouraged but recklessness was corrected. The squadron thrived under their combined influence. Junior pilots developed faster because Rivera taught them to think rather than just execute. Missions succeeded because Catherine ensured the operational planning matched the tactical requirements. The A-10s flew hard and came home intact, which was the only metric that truly mattered. One evening, working late in the operations center, Catherine and Rivera reviewed the quarterly performance data. The numbers told a story of excellence: high mission success rate, 0 incidents, strong readiness posture. "We're doing something right," Catherine observed. Rivera nodded. "We're maintaining standards and taking care of people. Everything else follows from that foundation. The A-10 gives us the platform, training gives us the skills, but the commitment to not accepting mediocrity or cutting corners, that's what makes the difference." "Is that what you'll teach your daughters?" Catherine asked. "That standards matter." "I teach them that competence matters," Rivera replied. "That doing things well matters, not for recognition or reward, but because it's the right way to live. My daughters see me prepare for missions the same way they prepare for school projects, thoroughly, carefully, with attention to detail. They see me maintain standards even when it's easier not to. That's the lesson. Not that their dad flies jets, but that their dad does his work with integrity." It was the philosophy that had defined Rivera's career, now being passed to the next generation. Catherine found comfort in the continuity, the sense that the values they maintained would outlast their individual service. 2 years passed. Rivera was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given squadron command. Catherine moved with him as his operations officer, their partnership now formalized through the organizational structure. Emma and Sophie were 12 now, entering the complicated years of adolescence with the added complexity of having a father whose work took him away regularly. Rivera adapted, finding ways to stay connected through video calls and messages, making the most of every period at home station. The squadron deployed again, this time to a different region but facing similar challenges, providing close air support to ground forces in contested territory, maintaining readiness, teaching newer pilots how to survive and succeed. Rivera commanded from the front, flying missions alongside his pilots, demonstrating standards rather than just mandating them. One mission crystallized everything Rivera had built over his career. A massive offensive operation required coordination of multiple A-10 flights supporting an entire battalion's advance. Rivera led the air element, Catherine coordinated from the operations center, and together they orchestrated a complex ballet of aircraft, weapons, and timing. The operation lasted 9 hours. Rivera and his pilots flew in rotation, maintaining continuous coverage, adapting to changing ground situations, delivering precision fires that enabled the advance. Not a single friendly casualty occurred during the ground operation. Enemy resistance was systematically neutralized. The objective was secured ahead of schedule. Afterward, Rivera gathered his pilots for debrief. Catherine listened via speaker as he walked through the operation, highlighting what worked, addressing minor issues that could be improved, praising specific instances of good judgment. He emphasized teamwork over individual performance, collective success over personal recognition. The battalion commander sent a formal letter of commendation for the air support. The ground force officers specifically mentioned Rivera by name, noting his leadership and tactical acumen. But true to form, Rivera distributed credit throughout his squadron, emphasizing that success came from team effort and thorough preparation. "You deflect recognition like most people deflect criticism," Catherine told him privately. Rivera shrugged. "The squadron did the work. I just coordinated it. And everything we accomplished came from training you helped develop, standards we maintained together, pilots you helped screen and assign. The recognition belongs to everyone or it belongs to no one. Either way, it's not about me." 3 months later, Rivera received devastating news. His daughter Sophie had been diagnosed with leukemia. The prognosis was uncertain. Treatment would be intensive. The deployment was immediately cut short under family emergency provisions. Rivera departed within hours. Catherine took over operational command in his absence, maintaining the squadron's tempo while sending regular updates to keep Rivera connected. The emails from Rivera were brief. Sophie was responding to treatment. Emma was struggling with the uncertainty. He was holding it together but barely. The squadron rallied around their commander despite his absence. Pilots flew their missions with extra precision, as if honoring Rivera through perfect execution. The operations center ran flawlessly, Catherine channeling everything Rivera had taught her about leadership and standards. 6 weeks passed before Rivera returned, and when he did, he looked like he'd aged years. The stress of watching his daughter fight for her life had carved lines deeper into his face. But he returned to command with the same quiet competence, refusing to let personal crisis degrade professional performance. "How is Sophie?" Catherine asked privately. "Fighting," Rivera replied. Responding to treatment better than expected, the doctors are cautiously optimistic. Emma's appointed herself Sophie's protector and entertainment director. "They're both stronger than I expected, stronger than I am, frankly." "You're allowed to struggle," Catherine said gently. "You're allowed to not be the unshakable professional every moment." Rivera nodded slowly. "I know, and I do struggle, but not here. Here I'm the commander. These pilots need stability and leadership, not a commander who's barely holding together. So I struggle at home, during the video calls with my daughters, in the quiet moments. But when I'm here, I'm the lieutenant colonel who maintains standards and takes care of people. That's the role. I'll fill it until I can't." It was both admirable and concerning, the compartmentalization required to function at high level despite personal crisis. Catherine wondered how long Rivera could maintain it, but she didn't press. He knew his limits better than anyone. The deployment ended 2 months later. The squadron returned home with commendations and 0 losses. Rivera had commanded through personal crisis without letting it affect operations. It was testament to either extraordinary discipline or unsustainable compartmentalization. Back at home station, Catherine watched Rivera navigate the balance between command responsibilities and single father of a seriously ill child. He attended Sophie's treatments, managed Emma's activities, maintained his presence in the squadron. The juggling act was obvious to anyone paying attention. Sophie's treatment progressed successfully. The leukemia went into remission after 6 months of intensive therapy. The relief was visible in Rivera, not the dropping of a mask, but the lifting of a weight that had been threatening to crush him. The squadron celebrated quietly, respecting the family's privacy while acknowledging shared relief. Rivera's daughters visited the squadron for the first time during a family day event. Emma and Sophie, now 13, were poised and articulate, clearly their father's children in temperament. They toured the flight line, saw the A-10s up close, listened to pilots describe the mission. Sophie stood in front of her father's aircraft for a long time, studying the weathered gray paint, the battle damage repair patches, the stenciled mission marks. "This is what you fly?" she asked Rivera. "This is my aircraft," Rivera confirmed. "Not beautiful, but very effective." "It's beautiful," Sophie said firmly. "It looks like it doesn't quit, like it keeps going no matter what." Rivera's expression softened. "That's exactly what it is. The A-10 is built to absorb damage and keep fighting. It's built to bring pilots home even when everything goes wrong. It's built for persistence." "Like you," Emma added quietly. Rivera knelt to be at eye level with his daughters. "Like all of us. You both just proved you can face terrible situations and come through them. That's the same quality this aircraft has. It's not about never getting hurt. It's about refusing to quit when you do." Catherine watched the exchange from a respectful distance. Rivera's daughters understood their father better than he probably realized. They'd seen him maintain presence through their mother's death, through deployments, through Sophie's illness. They'd learned persistence not from speeches but from observation. The years continued. Rivera was promoted to colonel and given wing command. Catherine moved with him again, now his director of operations, their partnership spanning over a decade. The A-10 community was small enough that everyone knew their story. The pilot who'd flown through canyons and stayed over downed aviators, and the operations officer who'd coordinated it all from the ground. Rivera's daughters graduated high school. Emma accepted appointment to the Air Force Academy, planning to study engineering. Sophie chose civilian college with intention to become a pediatric oncologist. Both paths reflected their experiences. Emma inspired by her father's service, Sophie driven by her own battle with cancer. Rivera attended both graduation ceremonies, his pride evident even through his usual reserve. The legacy he'd built wasn't just professional excellence. It was raising daughters who understood service, who valued competence, who faced challenges with persistence. At 52 years old, Rivera remained in command, still flying occasionally, though his primary role was leadership rather than tactical employment. His hair had gone silver, his face deeply weathered, but his presence remained formidable. Young pilots sought his mentorship. Ground commanders requested his unit specifically. He'd become the living embodiment of A-10 culture, relentless, competent, committed. Catherine organized a squadron ceremony marking Rivera's 30th year of service. The event included current and former pilots, ground officers he'd supported, the Marine Corporal DeMarco who'd named his daughter River, the Special Operations Commander Hayes whose team Rivera had supported. The testimonials painted a portrait of sustained excellence, of a career defined by moment after moment of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. When Rivera spoke, his remarks were brief. "I've been privileged to fly with extraordinary people, to support ground forces who face dangers I only witness from above, to raise daughters who taught me more about courage than any combat mission. The A-10 gave me a platform. The missions gave me purpose. But the people, the pilots, the operators, the Marines, the family, they gave me reasons. Thank you for 30 years of reasons to show up, to do the work, to maintain standards. It's been the honor of my life." The speech was vintage Rivera, deflecting credit, emphasizing others, finding meaning in service rather than recognition. But everyone present understood they were witnessing something rare, a career that had maintained integrity from beginning to end, that had balanced competing demands without compromising core values. Colonel Catherine Dalton, now wearing her own eagles, closed the ceremony with final remarks. She spoke about Rivera's tactical innovations, his mentorship, his leadership. But she focused most on his persistence, the quality that defined everything he did. When Rook was Rivera's call sign, before command, before the medals, there was a pilot who refused to accept that distance or danger or depleted ammunition meant abandoning people who needed help. That same quality defined him as a commander, as a father, as a mentor. He taught us that persistence isn't stubbornness. It's the refusal to quit when quitting would be easier but wrong. That's the legacy of this career. Not the canyon runs or the medals, but the sustained commitment to doing difficult things because they matter. Rivera retired 2 years later, his final flight a simple training sortie with no drama or emergency. He landed, taxied to parking, shut down the engines for the last time. The traditional water cannon salute arced over his aircraft as he climbed down. His daughters were present, now young women, watching their father conclude the career that had defined their childhoods. The retirement ceremony was large, attended by the full spectrum of people Rivera had impacted over 3 decades. Generals spoke about his tactical contributions. Ground commanders described missions where his presence had saved lives. Pilots he'd mentored talked about lessons that extended beyond flying. Emma Rivera, now a second lieutenant fresh from the academy, presented her father with a shadow box containing his medals, his wings, and a photo of his A-10. Sophie read a letter she'd written about growing up with a father whose work she didn't fully understand until facing her own crisis, and realizing the persistence he demonstrated professionally was the same quality that had kept their family together through impossible circumstances. Rivera's final remarks were longer than usual. Perhaps recognizing this was the last time he'd speak to the community that had been his professional home. He talked about the A-10's mission, not the technical specifications but the philosophy. Close air support isn't about the aircraft or the weapons, he said. It's about the commitment between people on the ground and people in the air. It's the promise that someone's watching, someone's staying, someone refuses to leave until everyone goes home. That's what I tried to honor every flight. Not perfection but persistence. Not invulnerability but commitment. The A-10 made that possible through its design. The people I flew with made it meaningful through their trust. He concluded by thanking Catherine specifically, acknowledging their decade-plus partnership. Major Dalton became Colonel Dalton, but she was always Rook, steady, intelligent, essential. Every mission I flew was better because she was coordinating it. Every decision I made as commander was better because she was there to refine it. Partnership matters in this business. Find people you trust, who trust you, who hold you to standards you might not maintain alone. That's how you build something that lasts. After the ceremony, after the reception, after the final goodbyes, Rivera found Catherine in a quiet corner. "What's next for you?" he asked. "I stay," Catherine replied. "I've got a few more years before retirement. I'll keep training operations officers, keep maintaining standards, keep honoring what we built together." Rivera nodded. "Good, the mission continues. That's what matters, not that any individual stays forever, but that the standards persist, that the next generation learns what we learned, that the commitment to the ground forces we support never wavers." "And you?" Catherine asked. "What's next for Colonel Rivera?" "Just Marcus now," Rivera said with a slight smile. "Former Colonel Rivera. I'm going to spend time with my daughters, watch them build their own careers, maybe teach part-time at the War College, share some lessons with the next generation of commanders. Stay connected to the mission in whatever way proves useful. The uniform comes off, but the obligation to contribute doesn't." They stood together in comfortable silence, two professionals whose careers had intersected and elevated each other, whose partnership had built something larger than individual achievement. "Thank you," Catherine said finally, "for the canyon runs and the medals and the leadership, but mostly for showing me what sustained excellence looks like, for proving that competence and decency aren't mutually exclusive, for maintaining standards when it would have been easier to compromise." Rivera shook his head slightly. "We maintained them together. Every flight I took was supported by your coordination. Every standard I enforced was backed by your operations planning. Partnership, Rook. That's the lesson. None of us do this alone." He walked away, no longer in uniform, but carrying the same quiet competence that had defined his career. Catherine watched him rejoin his daughters, saw them laugh at something he said, witnessed the casual affection of a family that had survived challenges together. The A-10s on the flight line sat waiting for tomorrow's missions, their ungainly profiles unchanged by the passage of command or the retirement of pilots. The mission would continue. New pilots would learn to thread canyons and stay over down aviators. New operations officers would coordinate fires and maintain standards. But the legacy of how it was done right, how competence and commitment could coexist with decency and care, that legacy was Rivera's permanent contribution. Catherine returned to her office, to the planning boards and mission schedules, to the work that had defined her career. The persistence Rivera had demonstrated wasn't about never stopping. It was about making sure what you built outlasted your time building it. That's what they'd accomplished together. Not individual heroics, but sustained excellence. Not moments of brilliance, but decades of competence. Not the myth of the lone warrior, but the reality of partnership and shared commitment to standards that mattered. The story didn't end with retirement. It continued in every pilot who flew with precision and stayed when leaving would be easier. It continued in every operations officer who refused to cut corners or accept good enough when excellent was possible. It continued in Emma Rivera's choice to serve and Sophie's choice to heal. Legacy wasn't what you did. It was what persisted after you stopped doing it. That was the final lesson of Marcus Rivera's career, that the work mattered more than the individual, that standards outlasted the people who maintained them, that persistence meant building something that didn't require your presence to survive. The sky over the base was clear and blue, exactly the way Rivera had always claimed it should be for flying. The A-10s would take off tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Pilots would support ground forces in places whose names would change but whose dangers remained constant. Operations officers would coordinate from rooms filled with screens and radios, connecting aircraft to objectives, presence to purpose. And somewhere, a former colonel named Marcus Rivera would watch his daughters build their lives, secure in the knowledge that he'd done his part, maintained his standards, left things better than he'd found them. The mission continued. That was enough. That had always been enough.